Okay, great. We can get started now. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining NIAC Los Angeles today in conversation with Ari Honarvar, the author of the newly published book, A Girl Called Rumi. My name is Sanaz Jahangard. I'm a member of NIAC LA's leadership group. I'm excited to introduce our speakers today. Ari John is an award-winning writer, visual artist, speaker, and journalist, writing on topics such as social justice, parenting, and mental health. Her words have appeared on publications including The Washington Post and The Guardian. Ari is also the author of Rumi's Gift, published in 2018. She's the Iranian musical ambassador of peace and the founder of Drop Poems, Not Bombs. We're very much excited to learn more about Ari and her new book. Our moderator today is Sara Haghdoosti. Sara John is the Deputy Director and Senior Strategist at Win Without War. She's also a writer and organizer and has been working on social campaigns around the world for over a decade. If you have any questions for Ari or Sara, please post them in the Q&A or chat. If time permits, we will discuss them at the end. Please join me in welcoming Ari and Sara. I will pass the mic over to Sara now.
Brilliant. Well, first of all, I just want to start by thanking NIAC for hosting this wonderful event. It is such a privilege to be here. And I want to say congratulations, Ari June, for this fantastic book. I have been reading it all week, and I just want to say if anyone's here who hasn't read the book, get yourself a copy. This is a fantastic read, and it has been one of my favorite books of the year. So first of all, how are you feeling I imagine there's lots of like offers, events of things, but how does it feel having this book out in the world?
I'm really happy about my publisher is wonderful, First Avenue Press, first of all. And I'm so excited to be here. This is my first Iranian American event, as I was telling you earlier. Thank you so much, NIAC, for hosting me, and Sara and Sanaz for the introduction. Thank you so much.
Brilliant. Well, I have a ton of questions for you on this book. And the first one is, the book is set in two different times. One is during the Iran-Iraq War, and the other is very much during the big protests that were happening in 2009. What drew you to those times in particular? And especially, I thought it was really unique pairing them together as well.
Yeah, thank you. I was a little bit younger than the main character, Kimia, in 1981. She's 9 years old. And I wanted to show the world through the eyes of a child growing up in those times in where I grew up, Shiraz, the city of poets and wine. But what happened in my own story was that when I was 6, when women of Iran lost their right to ride a bicycle or sing in public, and music and dancing became illegal, and freedom of expression became curtailed, and dissidents were punished. So the Saddam Hussein, a few months after this, took advantage of the internal turmoil and attacked Iran, and as we know, started a war that lasted 8 years and destroyed countless lives. But when you say this out loud, even though so many of us have experienced it, it sounds fantastical, like something out of a dystopian novel, like a Handmaid's Tale. But we lived it, millions of us. I bet a lot of the participants present right now experienced this, or they had family or friends who went through the same. So what was fascinating to me was that we were being attacked from outside and from within, and there was an actual war. And then there was a war on joy. And this was a situation where people were so on the edge that they would have heart attacks from a door slamming too loudly, and kids and teenagers started having gray hair. There was so much loss and grief. For example, in my elementary school, there wasn't a kid who hadn't lost someone to war or the crackdown on the dissidents. But then the war on joy became such that our favorite pastimes became a crime: playing cards, backgammon, music, dancing. Girls couldn't run or laugh or bring any attention to themselves. We as girls had to cover our bodies and blend into the background while our civil liberties were being stripped away. People, of course, took to the streets and to protest, but the crackdowns became more brutal and the regime's tactics more horrific. I remember there were public hangings and there was lashings. And because we couldn't express ourselves and literally or figuratively let our hair down and summon joy, there was a war on our coping mechanisms. And this really hurt us in a different way. So we had two options: one, to take risks that could end our freedom or life, and the second one was to rely on the soul-saving power of poetry and storytelling to survive those dark days. And so we did both. I did both. And so but the war on coping mechanisms still continues. And in 2009, there was a ray of hope with the Green Uprising, the biggest anti-government movement since 1979. So I thought it would be a good moment to write about and juxtapose the two pivotal moments of unrest, as well as alluding to events of 1953 CIA coup. And of course, we know that what happened after that, and how the freedom for the fight for freedom still continues.
One of the people watching is wondering how old you were in 1979.
Are you trying to ask me how old I am now?
I'm not sure.
I was 6 years old. Yeah.
Yeah. I think what was really striking to me is the book obviously deals with some really heavy topics. Like, it talks about the impact of the war. It talks about the curtailing of the freedoms and how it impacts different people. And like, it impacts different people really differently. What I also really loved about your book, like just the way you said about the power of storytelling and the power of poetry, your writing is so incredibly evocative. Like, when you read the book, you can go through the heaviness, but you're one of those writers that writes with all senses. Like, you talk about how things taste and how they smell and the textures. And so often I felt myself walking through the streets of Shiraz as I was reading it. And there's such a joy, like that joy you talk about comes through in it, even though you're talking about such hard things. And I wanted to ask you how you work to achieve that, because I'm a writer too. I know that's really hard. And I wanted to just say, like, did you rely on journals? Were you working off memories? Were you doing research? Like, how did you tap into writing with all of those senses and being able to bring us that world so clearly?
Thank you. You're so kind, by the way. قربان شما. I don't have any journals from that time. So much of the book was, for me, a dance between memories and imagination. I did a bit of research just to keep the timelines and description of place and events somewhat accurate. But because it's fictional work, I really savor the freedom of world building without being too constrained. And yes, I infuse the book with moments of joy, because when everything is terrible, there's always a bit of joy that seeps in. Joy is this irrepressible sustainable fuel that keeps us going, and it's clean fuel, unlike anxiety and fear. So it's sustainable and it's clean, and I really wanted to get that on the page.
Yeah, it definitely came through. One of my favorite scenes from the book is when you describe a chai khone and people reciting poetry, and then like you talked about the taste of faluda and all of that, and I was just like, oh, this is incredible. Was there a particular passage you wrote or a particular scene you wrote that brought you a lot of joy while you were writing it?
Yeah, in every scene, I try to ground myself in the senses, in the virtual reality of my imagination, and really feel what it was like, what the texture of the clothes were like, what the cracks in the sidewalk felt like as you walked on, and what the smells and the sounds. So I don't have a particular scene in mind, but even in the imaginal scenes, I was very much about the sensory aspect of the writing.
Yeah, it was beautiful. Congratulations on that. On a slightly different note, like the book obviously also talks a lot about trauma, both the trauma of freedoms being lost, the trauma of the war, the trauma that comes through family dynamics and all of that. And it also, I think, was really fascinating in how you showed how different characters experienced that trauma and how it impacted different people's mental health really differently. And I just wanted to ask, how did you approach that? Like, again, those are really hard topics to write about. What was your approach there and how did you think through it?
So I should preface this by saying that I run drama and dance sessions as a way of healing for refugees and asylum seekers who have experienced so much trauma in their lives. And one of the reasons is, again, that infusion of joy to sustain us, to give us resilience. And also, I wanted to bring what was denied to me as a child, which was music and dancing as a way of healing, and also a sense of community, something that I really craved for as a newcomer together. So I joined Musical Ambassadors of Peace, which is this organization which I work through, and then later with Gente Unida. So with these two border rights organizations, I've danced with victims of torture, freed ISIS sex slaves, refugees from Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq, Iran, Haiti, Central America, and so on. Thousands of people, mostly women and children. And by the way, there are videos and links and articles on rumywithaview.com under projects if anyone wants to see that. As part of the program I've created, besides dancing, we spend time with those who need extra support. And we teach resilience building exercises for the challenges that might come ahead, and ways for people to cope. And so I've been exposed to so many ways that people cope with trauma. The nervous system is just such a miraculous, has such miraculous capabilities. And then on top of that, we have this, so that's one way people, these are the ways that people deal with trauma. But then we have the mystical madness of Persian poets. So while trauma becomes a prison of sorts, mystics seek madness as a way of freedom. And when they embrace this state, they're besotted by the glory of their own madness, as I explore in the book. And I wanted to bring that element in as well, the spectrum and nuances of mental health as it pertains to the wondrous nervous system and consciousness.
Brilliant. I wanted to ask you about that because you explore so much Iranian poetry, Iranian mythology, and lore in your book, from you talk about the Simroch to the story of Zahak. How did you pick which stories to highlight in the book? Did like inspiration strike you? Did they choose you? Did you choose them? Would love to hear a little bit about that.
I dreamed of Seymour ever since I can remember. So she was in my DNA, whether I wanted it or not. So she's always been part of my psyche. And the story of Zahak particularly resonated with me because so many young folks became sacrificial offerings to the insatiable snakes of hatred and fanaticism in post-revolution Iran. There was always a little bit of that going on, but it really accelerated. So many were imprisoned, executed, and my own neighbor's daughter was a teenager when she was executed, and her name was Roya, which is one of the main characters in the book. And Roya, to me, became this ever-present witness to all that went on in our street in Shiraz. And it wasn't just the outright killings. Young people continue to wilt because they aren't able to express themselves. And the story of Zahak, the Serpent King, is such a perfect myth for these times, and he ruled for 1,000 years of darkness. And then I sprinkled different other stories, and of course, the Seven Valleys of Love, the myth, is what anchors us in the book, anyways, and then some stories from Maulana, Rumi, Masnavi, and other places too.
I love that the Simroch chose you. That's really incredible. There's one poem in the book that appears a few times that I'm not familiar with. I'm just going to read it quickly. It's Sara and Dara looking at a map, lightning, thunder, clap, clap, clap. Two fell down, one didn't rise. Which one, which one? Tell me no lies. Is that a reference to something, or I would love to hear more about that rhyme because it stayed with me as I was reading the book.
So yeah, Sara and Dara are a bit like Jack and Jill for Iranians, I guess. Like many Iranians, I learned to read and write. I've learned to spell Sara and Dara before other names, and that's why I chose them. The rhyme is a bit of a haunting rhyme that contains so many emotions for Kimia. This is something that I just made up on my own, but childhood rhymes, from what I gather, they contain so much emotion and nostalgia, grief, longing, childhood friendships, joy, and so much more. And I really wanted to have that as a thread throughout the book as well.
Yeah. I love that. I'm so impressed that was a poem you wrote and not a reference to something else. So
yeah, if it was a Persian, it would just totally be different. But yeah, I made it up for the American audiences so they could tap into a little bit of what it felt like to have gone through the trauma of what our main character went through.
Yeah. But also, like, as I kept reading it, it reminded me of like Ring Around the Rosie, like that old childhood poem as well. So like I thought it was such a beautiful blend of cultures that you achieved on that.
Yeah, and that one is also about the plague, right? Or the
exactly. Yeah. So like it was the nice, like they're both like about traumatic events. So I love fantasy. It is also like a genre that I really enjoy. So I really reveled in the magical realism of this book and the way you I think you dance that line between, it's always ambiguous where it's like, are we part of Kimia's imagination? Is this actually happening? Or like there's some of it is like feels incredibly mystical and magical. How did you balance that out? And like, did you at like any point where you like, no, I want the magic to be stronger and then have to pull yourself back? Or is it just a part of like the way you write and see the world, and it just happened to come through the book?
Yeah, I don't know if I have a clear process of how that happened. I guess it's a little bit like when I ask my mom for a recipe and she says a little turmeric, a little zareshk, a little some onions, and but she's she never gives an actual recipe. So I feel like the way that I balance the fantastical and reality, the only thing that was a little clear for me was the Seven Valleys of Love at TAR's Conference of the Birds, and that kind of provided an anchor of sorts for a landmark that juxtaposed real events surrounding this timeless myth.
Do you have any advice for the rest of us? Because like the seven like valleys of the birds as well, like it feels like such a like process of self-actualization and realization. Like if any of us are trying to go on that journey to get there, do you have any advice on how to navigate it as someone who wrote about someone who feels like a shepherd of that process?
Oh, wow. That's a great question. And I would say that, our paths are as unique as our fingerprints. And but what I do encourage everyone, because the path is so brutal. So and just keeping the joy alive when you can. If not, if it's too overwhelming and there is too much hardship, then have a little bit of curiosity. Let the curiosity be there for the awareness of the senses and where things are going. And then the doors of perception are something that will have their own organic kind of way about them, about opening.
You also wrote about like the book it comes from different perspectives. It's not just written in one character's perspective. And you write about Baba Morshed, who's one of my favorite characters in the book. And he is kind of like the shepherd taking Kimia through these valleys and like the key storyteller of the book. And then you have someone like Mortaza, who is like in the Basij and like part of like someone who is also causing tremendous amounts of harm. How did you navigate writing such different personalities? And was there one where you were like, this person feels really easy to write, this person feels incredibly hard to write?
Yeah, I think this is something that happens to a lot of fiction writers, is that the characters come in and whisper their what they want to say to the writer, and this definitely happened. And the voices were very distinct and very adamant, and they were making very good arguments for their own existence and why they choose the path that they choose. So I kind of pretty much let them tell the story, and yeah.
Yeah. I thought you did such an incredible job humanizing even the unlikable characters. Like, I'm not going to give any spoilers, but there's one scene that's really hard to read where there's someone in solitary confinement and someone else is essentially torturing them. But in the middle of it, gets a call from his wife and is like, no, cut the cake. I'm sorry, we're short staffed and I have to work late. And it was like I found it really powerful to like break up that scene. But even as someone is doing something so terrible, you still had that moment of like, they're still human and they're grounded in something human you can relate to. And was that hard to access, or when the whispers came to you, did they just come more as like you could see them and it's like, I don't necessarily agree with you, but I can write you and be true to what you are?
Yeah, I pretty much, I would say that every character is a different aspect of myself. And I might not agree, and if because we all contain multitudes, and there are ways that if each each character has their own logic and their own way that they go about living their lives. And even that character who is is just doing such brutal things, he has such solid logic of why he's doing those things. And I didn't want to make my antagonists as empty and caricaturish as sometimes we see in, especially in Hollywood movies. I wanted them to have depth and humanity and a voice and a reason and ways that they could express themselves.
Yeah. And I thought they were much more chilling for that as well, given I thought that was incredibly effective. You also did all of the translations for the poetry in the book yourself, which feels like a pretty extraordinary feat. What was that like? Are you someone who has done translations for a long time? Was it an easy process? Was it a grueling process?
Yeah, so I'm basically migrated to the US at the age of 14 without my parents and under extraordinary circumstances. And my life at the time became all about learning English and fitting in and just not succumbing to depression and homesickness and getting rid of any signs of otherness that would exclude me. And so then I forgot my poetry and just all the magic, my fraught past that contained both the magic and the pain became somewhat of a vestigial organ, something that I had no use for. And so it was maybe a decade later when I had an encounter with this ascending feeling that was kind of like the Seymour. And it was like a mythical bird soaring into the skies. And out of nowhere, I would find myself reciting Persian poetry aloud in Farsi in gatherings as a response to a question or just to express myself, a point. And to my surprise, the other people who were listening, Americans mostly, they didn't say, "Oh my God, she's mad, let's get her out of here." Instead, they said, "That was beautiful. Can you translate that?" So I began actually making paintings of calligrams out of Persian verses first, because I didn't feel like my translations were doing justice to the original poetry, and wanted to pour my feelings about those poems into the paintings as a way of saying, yeah, I'm not good enough to do this, but here's something that I can I have expressed my feelings in. But many encouraged me to translate anyways, because up to recently, most popular English collections of Persian poetry, Farsi. So I came up with Rumi's Gift Oracle card set, which is a nod to our own Fal, Persian divination, and also make a bridge with the Western Tarot. The Oracle card deck contains images and original translations of Rumi poems and a booklet of meditations and stories that were passed down to me by my grandfather. And I was fortunate enough that I had my mother, who is a published poet in Iran and Persian literature scholar, and she helped me with the intricacies and the nuances of Rumi's work. So from then on, I decided to do all the translations myself.
My God, I'm so excited to get a copy of that, like the files. That sounds amazing.
Yeah.
I also I imagine of the people who are currently watching us as well, there are some who are very familiar and probably talk in verse during their day to day, and others who might be a little bit intimidated by trying to read some of the more classic Persian poetry like Maulana or even Rumi sometimes. Do you have any advice for someone who is keen but is I don't know if I'm quite going to get it, or this seems a little bit harder? Do you have any advice for anyone trying to navigate that journey?
Are you talking about in the original language?
Yes.
Uh-huh. Yeah. So what I've started doing is putting reels of my favorite Rumi verses on Instagram, and this is in Farsi and English. And one thing that people, Americans especially, have commented is that cadence and the words are just so, just the language is just so beautiful. Almost you don't need a translation. It just kind of goes an immediate transmission into your soul. So I would just begin, reciting it, even if you don't necessarily understand it, because it's so beautiful to the heart to hear it. And then eventually you will find a way to understand the words and the meanings.
I love that. I think it speaks to trusting that our souls will understand it in a way that we might not be ready to understand it yet. I think just feels so fitting to the whole concept of poetry that we're talking about as well.
Mhm.
On a side note, I'm so glad that you rediscovered that poetry and your connection to it and are now sharing it with all of us. I know that your book has definitely inspired me to go back and look at some of this poetry and really get into it again. And I'm sure that's a gift you're going to be giving countless other people. So I just wanted to appreciate you for that, because that feels like a huge gift.
Thank you so much.
And I kind of have two they're the flip side of each other. I want to know what your favorite scene to write was, and then on the flip side, what was a scene that felt really hard to write as well?
I would say one of my favorite scenes is from the perspective of Kimia's brother Arman, who has cut all ties to his Iranian past and calls himself Tony. And in that scene, he is talking with his best friend, who is Chinese American, about a moment in Iran that has been haunting him for 28 years. But he's talking around it and not able to actually say what happened, what he did. It's a kind of a tragic and comical scene. And then there is a scene from Reza's perspective, and Reza is the 10-year-old best friend of Kimia's. And that was a really magical scene for me to write. The process of it was magical. And as far as the hardest, I would say the ending. I wasn't sure how the book wanted to end itself, with hope or with despair. And both endings seemed perfectly reasonable.
Yeah. I was going to ask you a question about your writing process. So there's usually two classes of writers, one who sits down and structures a book and map out every chapter and then write it. And then there are others that are more go with the inspiration and then write that draft and then edit it. I have a feeling you're the second style, but I wanted to ask about it.
Yeah, I think I wrote, I read almost the entire book in a month. It just kind of poured through me. And then, I had many, many revisions of the draft. But the bones and the essence of it came together in a very fast, in a kind of a stream. So
yeah, that's were you like, if you wrote that first draft in a month, that's incredible. Did you have like writing goals? Did you have to write 500 words a day? Or was it just like you sat down when inspiration hit and just wrote what was on your mind?
Yeah, I don't really ever have those kinds of rules. So when it was, I had no choice. The characters were very, very loud. And, even when I was sleeping, they were talking to me, and I just had to get them on the page and the place on the page. So it was a situation that it would hurt if I didn't write. And I had like I couldn't even talk. I was just, all my words were budgeted for this book in that month that it happened.
That's incredible. I remember when I was writing my book, I had my main character I really struggled with, and it felt like she was really argumentative. Like whenever I wrote her, she then changed her mind and then transformed into slightly someone else. And I had to be like, who are you? Stop changing on me. Did you have a character that like was really argumentative with you while you were going through this process?
I would say Kimia was not necessarily argumentative, but she was um, very pale, I would say. She wasn't really textured. She was just a shadow of herself. And I think her mother says that at one point, it's like, you're a shadow of your former self. But there's one thing about the character being the shadow versus the writing being kind of pale. And my writing was just not good enough. And eventually, I had a really wonderful mentor, and she helped, Renee Denfeld, and she helped me. She kind of said, she took one scene and she's like, look at this, and what's wrong with this? And she kind of went through it, and then it just kind of all clicked from there.
It's amazing. It's so fascinating because Kimia feels like such a vibrant character in the book that goes through so many evolutions where, like, when she says, like, there's the sirens that warn everyone that danger is coming, and she like longs for them almost. And then you can see her going to the US and kind of like going into herself and then coming back. Like, she has such a clear character arc that it's fascinating that she was one of the characters that you had to go through that evolution with.
Oh yeah, she went through so many incarnations before she became what she is now on the page.
Well, I'm glad she did because Kimia was one of my favorites as
Awesome.
I was reading the book. So I also wanted to talk to you a little bit about publishing and that process. Like there's been a lot written about how publishing isn't necessarily the most diverse of industries, and there's not that many women of color who are writing. How did you find that process of getting published, working with an editor? Yeah.
Yeah, it was incredibly difficult. That's a great question. Thank you for asking it. I probably had 4 years and over 100 rejections from agents. And it was finally my mentor, Renee Denfeld, suggested Forest Avenue Press, which was my publisher. And I submitted my manuscript to a slush pile, but that somehow miraculously resulted in my contract. And as you're saying, about 90% of books are written by white authors. I was looking at a New York Times article that 22 out of the 220 books on the New York Times bestseller list last year were written by people of color. So that also tracks. And New York Times, in my own personal experience, has never tried to review any books from my indie publisher that is committed to marginalized voices. And even though Forest Avenue has won so many awards and its authors have won awards and the reviews are absolutely stellar, and this is not a one-off. New York Times rarely reviews books from indie publishers, and big publishers reject so many people of color So wonderful books written by people of color from indie publishers rarely get a splashy review or enjoy big marketing campaign, and therefore don't end up on the bestseller lists, and it just kind of perpetuates the system.
Oh. I mean, I feel like there's a campaign, as a campaigner, I have to say there's a campaign there. Dear New York Times, if anyone has any connections there, ask them to review books from indie publishers, because indie publishers are incredible.
Absolutely.
And like your work is so important for literature and for the like incredible nuanced representations it provides of our community. So we definitely want to see more people like you writing these phenomenally brilliant books and getting the recognition they deserve for them. So
thank you. And you as well. I'm really looking forward to reading your book, Sunburnt Veils.
yes, the Sunburnt Veils. It's published in Australia, but also published by an indie publishing press. So I think there's something there about those presses being small and mighty and supporting so many of writers of color. So if you're listening, please do support all the indie publishers, buy those books, give them praise and love, because they absolutely need it and they do such a useful service, not just for literature, but our community. So that's really important.
Absolutely.
I have one last question for you before we open it up to the audience. But again, as someone who has navigated the publishing industry, and as you highlighted, it can be one that is often full of rejection and can be challenging. Do you have any advice for aspiring writers or anyone who might be watching who's working on their own manuscript right now?
Yes. Do what works for you. There are no dogmatic rules. What really worked for me and continues to work for me is honoring my fallow state and not having the compulsion to write. And that's the opposite of the conventional wisdom that tells us you have to write at the same time every day, whether you're into it or not. And I just unsubscribe to that. And I also infuse your life with joy, because joy, increasing our capacity for joy also increases our capacity for suffering. And there's a lot of suffering in the writing process. Every rejection ends up being it actually, because we're so we've evolved as social critters and want to have a sense of belonging. Rejection is kind of actually hurts our bodies, and sometimes you take ibuprofen for it. Now, I had a really fun way that I dealt with rejection, and I just went into my imaginal realm, and every character in my book ended up speaking their mind and what they thought of their rejection and what they were doing, and at different stages of their lives, and that became kind of its own beautiful magic. So if that works for you, do that too.
I love that. I also love the idea of joy as a practice and building resilience as well. Well, thank you so much for this conversation. It has been so great to talk to the author of a book who I have loved so much. And now I'm going to hand back to Sanaz June to open for Q&A.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Sara June. We do have a couple of questions, and one of them is from one of the audience members, Enrique Morones. And he says, speaking of movies, and your novel is amazing. I felt I was with you the entire journey. Is there another novel in the works, Ari June? And this person is saying that your work has shown them that they also have wings and they have the key to open the cage and fly. What a beautiful comment.
Oh.
But the question is, anything in the works in the future?
So I'm kind of in my fallow state of I'm writing little articles but no novels right now, what I am working on is a series of meditations based on Rumi's poetry, 21 Days of Rumi, and it would be poems turned into just put to music in Farsi and English with a little guided meditation for 21 days. So that's kind of where I'm at, and I'm super enjoying that right now.
Great. And then we have a question from Karina, who wants to know, do you sell your work on a website? I see actually on your website, which is rumiwithaview.com. If you click on the link with the book's name, I see there is signed copies actually, hopefully still available. Mysterious Galaxy, bookshop.org, Amazon, IndieBound. Is there anywhere else that you recommend? Maybe people can get a signed copy of your book?
Yeah, Mysterious Galaxy is the place that I've assigned all, because we're also, we're indie publishers and we support indie bookstores, which they're kind of struggling because of Amazon. So yeah, that's how we get to support each other in this journey with them.
Great. Again, everyone, please do visit Ari Jun's website. It is interesting. There is links to other projects. You can get a little glimpse of her book, and it's definitely enjoyable. And the website, which we have also posted in the chat, is rumiwithaview.com.
And there are, anywhere that they sell books, they sell the Rumi's, a Girl Called Rumi, and that's they can order it if they don't have a copy, and then also libraries too, which also we also support libraries.
Wonderful, very exciting. I don't have any other questions in the chat. I don't know, Sara, if you have any other questions. Otherwise, we could wrap up the program.
I think before we wrap up, since we do have a little bit of time, Ari, I was so inspired by your book and its celebration of Persian literature and poetry that I am also just going to invite attendees who are on the chat, if there is a particular line of Persian poetry that you enjoy, to share it in the chat right now as a way to celebrate Ari's great work and for us all to lean into that creative inspiration together. I am happy to share one of my favorite poems. This was like the first poem I learned in Farsi school, in Saturday school when I was growing up, and it's just stayed with me. But it's Feridun Moshiri's Kuche. بی تو مهتاب شبی باز از آن کوچه گذشتم همه تن چشم شدم. I don't know why, but there's something magical about that line. And for me, it was like discovering a new world and realizing that I could access it. So if anyone else has a line of poetry they want to share in the chat, please feel free. And Ari, if there's a line of poetry you'd like to share with us, although I know it might be hard to be put on the spot, you should feel free to.
I really, the one that I keep coming back to so many times is ای قوم به حج رفته کجایید کجایید معشوق همین جاست بیایید بیایید با این همه آن رنج شما گنج شما باد افسوس که بر گنج شما پرده شمایید. And for those who don't know you don't speak Farsi, the line that I'm super drawn to is, did you know that your suffering is your treasure? Alas, you are the veil covering your treasure.
Oh, incredible. And I see someone in the chat has also shared, this being human is a guest house, which is beautiful. Omid has said bah bah and thank you. And I just want to +1 Omid. Ari Jun, I feel like I can spend hours listening to you recite poetry and because you're so excellent at it. But I think with that, we can wrap up. Thank you again for this amazing book. Thank you, NIAC, for hosting such a fantastic event. And again, friends, if you haven't bought Ari's book yet, go out, buy it, support the indie publishers, support local bookshops. And the more that we can buy books like this, the more we'll create demand and space for more amazing Iranian American authors to be able to thrive and shine and follow in your incredible footsteps.
Thank you so much, Sanaz, Donna, Miriam, and of course, Sara. You've been such a beautiful, gracious host. And I'm, of course, looking forward to reading Sunburnt Veils. And one thing, I'm donating the proceeds from the sale of A Girl Called Rumi from November 30th to December 6th to NIAC, and supporting the wonderful work that they're doing. And if you end up reading and enjoying our stories, please leave a review on Amazon and Goodreads, and it helps with the visibility of our books to other readers. And feel free to subscribe to my mailing list for very infrequent updates and ongoing and upcoming projects.
Thank you, both of you, Ari June and Sara June, for your time and the inspiring and stimulating discussion. Thank you also to our viewers. We hope you enjoyed our program. As we said, you can find out more about Ari and her books, I should say, at her website, rumiwithoutaview.com. We would love to see you again on Sunday, December 19th at 5 p.m. for our Yalda virtual event. We will provide details through our social media soon. In the meantime, as Ari said earlier this evening, be joyful and curious. Have a good evening, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thanks. Bye.